Have you ever wondered what your spouse really thinks of you when you're not around? What would they say about you to a stranger? Would they even recognize the person they married if you were standing right in front of them? Queen Alara couldn't bear the growing distance between herself and King Ethelric any longer. As he danced with other women at royal banquets and grew increasingly cold toward her, a desperate plan formed in her mind. She would become invisible in plain sight, disguising herself as a common servant in her own castle to test if her husband could still love the woman beneath the crown. But what starts as a simple test quickly spirals into something far more dangerous as the king begins to open his heart to this mysterious new maid with the familiar eyes. What happens when a queen scrubs the floors of her own castle at dawn, only to serve wine to her husband by night? A husband who looks right through her, not recognizing the woman he once swore to love forever. And what terrible price must be paid when he begins to fall in love with his own wife, without knowing who she truly is? It was the darkest hour of night. The torches flickered weakly along the stone corridors, their flames dancing to the rhythm of the distant rain that pattered against the castle windows. The great hall, which had hours before echoed with laughter and music, now lay silent save for the scraping sound of a cloth against stone. On the cold floor knelt a woman, her rough-spun gray dress soaked at the knees, her hands red and raw from the harsh lye soap she worked into the flagstones. A coarse linen cloth covered her hair, but beneath it was a face that should never have known such labor, the face of Queen Alara herself. Her delicate fingers, once adorned with jewels and kissed by courtiers, now bled from tiny cuts as she scrubbed the very floor where, only hours before, her husband King Ethelric had danced with other women. Noble ladies who had laughed too loudly at his jests and stood too close during the evening's festivities. The contrast was brutal and deliberate. The most powerful woman in the kingdom, reduced to the station of a servant by her own choice. Each stroke of her cloth against the stone felt like a confession, each ache in her back a penance for believing that a crown guaranteed love. Alara had everything a woman could desire: wealth, power, beauty. Yet she felt hollow, a queen in title only. For months she had watched the light fade from her husband's eyes when he looked upon her, had noticed how his gaze lingered on other women, how his touch had grown perfunctory, a duty rather than a desire. The truth had become a splinter in her heart, festering with doubt. Did Ethelric love her at all, or merely the golden crown upon her head? Did he see her as a woman, or simply as the vessel that carried his royal authority? The questions tormented her until she could bear them no longer. And so Queen Alara had made a decision that would forever alter the course of 2 lives, and perhaps an entire kingdom. She had secretly arranged her own disappearance from the royal apartments, leaving behind conflicting clues that would keep the court guessing. Then, with the help of only one loyal handmaiden who had been sworn to secrecy upon pain of death, she had transformed herself into Lyra, a common serving woman newly arrived at the castle. The plan was dangerous, perhaps even treasonous, a queen abandoning her duties, deceiving her court, her husband, her people. Yet in her heart, Alara believed she had no choice. She needed to know the truth that the throne obscured. She suspected that the king's love was nothing more than habit, and that his heart now beat for another. To discover this truth, she had disguised herself as a maid, hiding her voice, her bearing, the radiance that came with a lifetime of privilege. Dawn approached, gray light seeping through the high windows. Soon the castle would awaken, and with it, the true test would begin. This very morning, Ethelric would pass by her without recognition, and when he looked into her eyes, something strange would happen. Would he sense the woman he had once loved beneath the servant's clothes? Or would he look through her, as invisible as all the others who scrubbed and served and faded into the background of his royal life? Alara's hands trembled as she wrung the cloth into a wooden bucket, the water turning dark with the dirt of celebration. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Early, too early, someone was coming. She kept her head bowed, her shoulders hunched in the posture of subservience she had practiced for days. Through the curtain of her lashes, she saw polished boots stop before her, a man's boots, fine leather, with silver buckles that caught the torchlight. "You're new," said a voice she knew better than her own. deeper in these early hours, but unmistakable. The king himself, wandering his castle before dawn. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't expected to confront him so soon, had not fully prepared her disguise, her voice, her story. Yet here he was, standing over her, waiting for a response. "Yes, my lord," she whispered, keeping her face down, altering the musical cadence of her speech to the rougher tones of a commoner. "I began yesterday." There was a pause, a moment too long for comfort. Then King Ethelric did something unexpected. He knelt down to her level, his fine clothes touching the damp stone she had just cleaned. "Look at me," he commanded, though his tone was gentler than his words. Slowly, reluctantly, Ilara raised her eyes to meet his. For a heartbeat, the king seemed to hesitate, as if something in her gaze disturbed him. A flicker of confusion passed across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of it. Then it was gone, replaced by a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "What is your name?" he asked, studying her face with curious intensity. "Lyra, your majesty," she answered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The name had been chosen with care, close enough to her own that she might respond naturally, different enough to avoid suspicion. The king's brow furrowed slightly. "Lyra," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "That name sounds familiar somehow." A cold wave of fear washed over Ilara. Could he have seen through her disguise so quickly? But then Ethelric smiled, a distant smile that told her he had no idea he was speaking to the echo of the woman he had sworn to love until death. "Well, Lyra," he said, rising back to his feet with fluid grace. "You worked diligently. The floor shines like it hasn't in some time." "Thank you, your majesty," she murmured, bowing her head once more, hoping he couldn't hear the wild beating of her heart. The king lingered, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. In their years of marriage, she had learned every nuance of his face, or so she had thought. But this look was new. Or perhaps it was simply that he had never before looked at her as a man looks at a servant, with that peculiar mixture of authority and dismissal. "From this day forward," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of royal command, "I want you to serve me personally each day." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "Your Majesty, in my private chambers, bring my meals, tend to my fire, see to my needs." He spoke casually, as if assigning the most mundane of tasks, not realizing he had just set in motion a test far more intimate and dangerous than she had planned. "But surely your Majesty has more experienced servants for such an honor," she protested weakly, suddenly afraid of her own scheme. The king's eyes narrowed slightly, unused to having his commands questioned, especially by a mere servant. "Are you refusing a direct order from your king?" "No, your Majesty, never," she quickly amended. "I am honored. I will serve you as best I can." "Good," he nodded, satisfied. "You will begin today. Report to the steward after the morning meal for your new duties." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Ilara remained kneeling on the stone floor, her mind racing with implications. The test she had devised had suddenly become far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. She would now be spending hours each day in close proximity to the husband who no longer recognized her. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the high windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the golden beams, Queen Ilara, now Lyra the servant, realized with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that the path she had chosen might lead to salvation or destruction. There would be no turning back now. The game had begun, and the stakes were nothing less than her heart, her marriage, and perhaps the future of the kingdom itself. In the days that followed, Ilara learned to walk like a servant, hunched, silent, invisible. Her back ached from the unnatural posture, so different from the regal bearing she had cultivated over years of court life. Her hands, once soft and scented with rosewater, grew calloused and red. She bound them with scraps of linen at night, applying stolen kitchen grease to the cracked skin, hiding the evidence of her noble birth one painful blister at a time. The castle she had ruled now became a strange, foreign place seen through a servant's eyes. Corridors she had glided through as queen now stretched endlessly before her as she carried heavy trays and bundles of firewood. Stairs she had ascended with graceful ease now made her legs tremble with exhaustion by day's end. The very air seemed different, heavier, filled with the sense of labor rather than luxury. Whetstone, tallow candles, lye soap, and sweat. Yet it was not the physical hardship that tested her resolve most severely. It was the way people looked through her rather than at her. Ladies who had once curtsied deeply in her presence now snapped orders without meeting her eyes. Lords who had once composed sonnets to her beauty now barely glanced at her as she poured their wine. She had become a ghost in her own castle, moving through rooms where her portrait hung on the walls, hearing her name spoken in concerned whispers as the mysterious disappearance of the queen became the subject of court gossip. And through it all, she watched her husband, watched him from corners and shadows, from behind pillars and tapestries. She observed King Ethelric when he thought no one was looking, when the mask of monarchy slipped to reveal the man beneath. What she saw surprised her. The king she had known, or thought she had known, had always seemed confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance. He had filled rooms with his presence, his laughter booming across the great hall during feasts, his commands ringing clear and decisive in council meetings. But now, as she watched him unseen, she discovered a different man, one who seemed bowed by the weight of the crown he wore, who sighed when alone, who stood at windows for long stretches, staring at nothing, his face etched with lines of weariness she had never noticed before. At night, when the castle grew quiet, he would often walk to the gardens alone, dismissing even his personal guard. There, by the small lake that reflected the moon, he would sit on a stone bench and simply breathe, as if the air inside the castle walls had grown too thin to sustain him. Ilara, hiding in the shadows of a yew hedge, watched his solitude and felt her heart constrict with a strange new ache. Was this loneliness something new, born of her absence? Or had it always been there, a secret she had failed to see? The revelation disturbed her. She had begun her deception convinced that Ethelric's heart had strayed, that his love for her had withered like autumn leaves. Yet here was evidence of a different kind of estrangement, not the passion of new love, but the desolation of isolation. Even surrounded by courtiers and servants, the king appeared profoundly alone. As the days passed, fate began to play a curious game with her carefully laid plans. The king began to notice Lyra in ways that servants rarely experienced. At first it was small requests: bring him wine instead of ale, stoke the fire in his chamber to a specific height. Then came questions about her life, her village, her family. Questions she answered with half-truths spun from her own childhood memories, altered to suit her fictional identity. "Tell me about where you grew up, Lyra," he asked one evening as she served his solitary supper in his private chamber. "I find I grow weary of court stories." Ilara hesitated, her heart racing. "A small village to the north, Your Majesty. Nothing that would interest a king." "Let me be the judge of that," he replied, gesturing for her to continue as he pushed away documents that had occupied his attention moments before. And so she told him tales of a life she had never lived but could imagine, of harvests and winter storms, of village festivals and the simple joys of common folk. She spoke of fictional brothers and a stern father, of a mother who sang while working at her loom. With each word, she wove the tapestry of Lyra's life, careful not to reveal the golden threads of Ilara's reality beneath. To her surprise, the king listened intently, asking questions that revealed genuine interest. When she described a spring festival where children danced around a maypole, his hand inadvertently touched hers as she poured more wine. The contact lasted only a moment, but Ilara felt a jolt pass between them, an electric recognition that he seemed to feel as well, but could not name. He drew back quickly, his brow furrowed in confusion. For an instant, tears threatened to betray her. This was the man she had married, curious, engaged, present in a way he had not been with her for too long. The pain of being loved by someone who had forgotten how to love her when she wore her true face was almost unbearable. Night after night, the king requested Lyra's presence, not for any service a queen might imagine with jealous heart, but simply to talk. He spoke to her of matters he had never shared with Alara as queen, his doubts about certain council decisions, his worries about the northern border, his memories of his own father's harsh lessons in kingcraft. Each time he revealed himself, each time he laughed at something she said or nodded thoughtfully at her observations, Alara felt both victory and defeat. She was winning back his attention, his regard, perhaps even his affection, but not as herself. The woman he was growing to care for did not exist. One evening, as she knelt to tend the fire in his chamber, he spoke her name, her servant's name, with a softness that made her hands tremble. "Lyra, do you ever wonder why people cannot see what stands before them?" She turned, finding him watching her with an intensity that made her blood rush to her cheeks. "What do you mean, Your Majesty?" "I find myself thinking of the Queen," he said, his voice low and troubled. "I miss her, though I realize I had begun to lose her even before she vanished." Alara's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead like a frightened deer. "How so, sire?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "She seems distant these past months, cold, untouchable." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration she knew well. "Perhaps she was always thus, and I merely failed to notice until now." The words struck her like physical blows. Cold, untouchable. Was that how he saw her? The woman who had lain awake so many nights wondering why his passion had cooled, why his gaze no longer lingered on her across crowded rooms. Swallowing the lump that threatened to choke her, Alara took a risk. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "the Queen simply wishes to be seen, not just admired. Perhaps the distance you feel is one you both created, step by small step, day by quiet day." The king stared at her, startled by the boldness of a servant offering such intimate counsel. For a moment, Alara feared she had overstepped, revealed too much. Then his expression softened into something like gratitude. "You speak wisely for one who has never worn a crown, Lyra," he said quietly. "Sometimes I think the throne stands between us like an invisible wall, separating me from her even when we occupy the same room." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. He had no idea of the double meaning in his words, the irony of confessing his marital troubles to the very woman from whom he felt estranged. The king rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the night sky where stars glittered like scattered diamonds. His shoulders, usually so straight and proud, seemed to curve inward with the burden of his thoughts. "Lyra," he said without turning, his voice carrying a note she had not heard in it for too long, a note of something like hope. "Tomorrow, come to the garden. I would see you in the daylight, away from these stone walls and the weight they carry." The invitation hung in the air between them, innocent in his mind, fraught with danger in hers. To meet him in the garden, in full daylight, would risk exposure. Someone might recognize her despite the servant's garb, the roughened hands, the altered speech. Yet to refuse would arouse suspicion, might end this strange connection before she understood what it meant. "As you wish, Your Majesty," she finally replied, lowering her eyes as a proper servant should, though inside her thoughts whirled like autumn leaves caught in a storm wind. He turned back to her then, and for the briefest moment, she saw in his eyes a spark of the man who had once courted her with poems and wildflowers, who had promised to love her beyond crown and kingdom, beyond life itself. "Until tomorrow, then," he said softly. As Alara slipped from the room, her mind raced with equal measures of anticipation and dread. What began as a test of his fidelity had become something far more complex, a mirror reflecting truths about their marriage she had not expected to find. The game she played grew more dangerous with each passing day, each unguarded word, each look that lingered too long. For she was falling in love with her husband all over again, while he was falling in love with a woman who did not exist. The sun rose over the kingdom in a glorious display of amber and gold, its warm rays kissing the dew-laden gardens of the castle. The morning air carried the sweet perfume of roses and the distant melody of birdsong. Alara stood before the small, cracked mirror in her servants' quarters, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. Today she would meet the king, her husband, in the daylight, away from the shadows that had thus far protected her deception. She examined her reflection with critical eyes. The weeks of servitude had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. The softness of her cheeks had given way to a sharper definition. Her skin, once pampered with milk baths and rare oils, now bore the sun-kissed glow of someone who worked outdoors. The fine lines around her eyes, previously masked by expensive cosmetics, were now visible marks of both worry and newfound wisdom. Most telling of all were her hands. She stared down at them, turning them over in dismay. These were not a queen's hands anymore. The delicate fingers that Ethelric had once kissed reverently before their court were now rough with calluses. The nails cut short and practical, the skin reddened from lye soap and scrubbing. She had tried to soften them with stolen kitchen grease each night, but nothing could fully restore what hard labor had taken. With trembling fingers, she fastened the simple linen apron over her plain wool dress. The fabric was coarse against her skin, so different from the silks and velvets that had once been her daily attire. She covered her hair with a cloth, tucking away the golden strands that might betray her. A queen's crown was her glory. A servant's virtue was her invisibility. "You are Lyra now," she whispered to herself. "Remember that." The walk to the garden seemed both endless and too brief. Each step brought her closer to a moment of truth she both longed for and dreaded. Servants and guards passed her without a second glance. The invisible woman who had once commanded their complete attention with a mere gesture. The royal garden was a place of carefully cultivated beauty, with paths winding between beds of flowers arranged by color and season. Fountains provided gentle music as water cascaded over carved stone. Ilara had often walked here as queen, attended by ladies-in-waiting who laughed at her every jest and admired her every observation. Now she entered alone, a servant summoned by a king who did not know he already possessed her heart. She found him waiting by the central fountain, his back to her, his figure cutting a striking silhouette against the morning light. He wore simpler garments than his usual court attire, a tunic of deep forest green, leather breeches, boots that had seen actual use. His crown was absent, his hair catching golden highlights in the sunshine. For a moment, he looked like the young prince she had fallen in love with years ago, before the weight of rule had settled upon them both. "Your Majesty," she called softly, dropping into the curtsy that had become second nature in her weeks of disguise. When King Ethelric turned to face her, time itself seemed to pause. The morning sunlight bathed them both in its golden glow, lending an almost ethereal quality to the moment. His eyes widened slightly as they fell upon her, and Ilara felt a flutter of panic. Had he recognized her? Had some mannerism or feature betrayed her true identity? But no, it was not recognition that softened his gaze, but something else entirely. Something that made her heart ache with both joy and sorrow. He was looking at her, truly looking at her, in a way he hadn't looked at Queen Ilara in far too long. "Lyra," he said, her false name sounding strangely intimate on his lips. "I feared you might not come." "You commanded it, sire," she replied, eyes downcast as befitted her station. "I would not disobey my king." "Not a command," he corrected gently. "An invitation. There is a difference." He gestured for her to walk beside him, an honor rarely afforded to servants. Together they strolled along the garden paths, the king pointing out rare flowers he had imported from distant lands, speaking of their properties and significance with unexpected passion. Ilara listened, careful to mask her familiarity with these same plants. She had often tended herself in quieter moments away from court duties. "Do you like the gardens, Lyra?" he asked after a comfortable silence had fallen between them. "They're beautiful, Your Majesty," she answered honestly, "though different from what I knew in my village." "How so?" "In my village, flowers grow where they will, not where they're told," she said, then immediately feared she had overstepped. But the king laughed, a genuine laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "A wise observation," he said. "Perhaps there's a lesson in that for kings as well as gardeners." They paused beneath the shade of a blooming apple tree, its white petals occasionally drifting down around them like snow. The king's expression grew thoughtful, almost melancholy. "Lyra," he said suddenly, "do you believe in love?" The question caught her off guard, striking directly at the heart of her deception. She swallowed hard, choosing her words with utmost care. "I believe in what remains when no one is watching," she answered finally. "I believe in the quiet moments that reveal a person's true nature, not the grand gestures performed for an audience." Ethelric stared at her, clearly taken aback by the depth of her response. For a terrifying moment, Alara feared she had revealed too much, had spoken with a wisdom that betrayed her disguise. "You are not what I expected, Lyra," he said quietly. "What did you expect, Your Majesty?" she dared to ask. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted with a small smile. "But certainly not someone who makes me question everything I thought I knew." The confession hung between them, weighted with implications neither fully understood. Alara felt a powerful urge to reveal herself then and there, to tear away the servant's cloth covering her hair, to stand tall as the queen she was, to demand that he explain why he could see Lyra so clearly while Alara had become invisible to him. But fear kept her silent. Fear and a growing realization that the truth might destroy whatever fragile connection was forming between them. If she revealed herself now, would he see it as a betrayal, a mad woman's scheme, or worse? Would he look at her with the same distant politeness he had shown his queen in recent months? "Your Majesty," she said instead. "The queen." "What of her?" His voice cooled noticeably. "They say she vanished without warning. Do you miss her?" The question was reckless, dangerous, but she had to know. Ethelric's face changed, shuddering like windows against an approaching storm. "The queen's disappearance is a matter of state concern, not suitable discussion for a garden walk." "Forgive me, sire," she said quickly, cursing herself for her clumsiness. I spoke out of turn. For several long moments they continued in uncomfortable silence. Then the king sighed deeply, as if releasing some tightly held emotion. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I miss her. Or perhaps more accurately, I miss who we were together once. Before..." "Before what, Your Majesty?" she prompted gently when he did not continue. "Before the crown became heavier than our hearts could bear," he finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The raw honesty of his words struck Alara like a physical blow. She had never heard him speak this way, had never realized how deeply he felt the burden of rulership, or how that burden had created a chasm between them. From a nearby tower, a bell rang the hour, breaking the spell of intimacy that had fallen over them. The king straightened, his royal demeanor slipping back into place like a well-worn glove. "I have kept you too long," he said. "You have duties, as do I." "Yes, Your Majesty," she murmured, dropping into another curtsy. As she began to turn away, he reached out suddenly, his fingers brushing against her wrist. The touch was light, almost accidental, yet it sent a current of awareness through her entire body. "Will you walk with me again tomorrow?" he asked, an unexpected vulnerability in his voice. "If it pleases Your Majesty," she answered, her own voice unsteady. "It would," he said simply. Unseen by either of them, a figure watched from an upper window of the castle. Lady Ravenna, the queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting and the only soul who knew of Alara's deception. Her eyes narrowed as she observed the intimate tableau below, the king and the supposed servant standing too close, speaking too familiarly. What had begun as a desperate scheme to test a husband's fidelity was evolving into something far more complex and dangerous. In the days that followed, the meetings continued, sometimes in the garden at dawn, sometimes in the quiet of the library as dusk fell. Always they talked, of philosophy, of governance, of simple pleasures and profound sorrows. With each conversation, Ethelric revealed more of himself, peeling away the layers of kingship to expose the man beneath. And with each revelation, Alara fell deeper into a paradox of her own making, watching her husband fall in love with a woman who both was and was not herself. The court began to buzz with whispers. Servants noticed the king's preference for the new maid's company. Guards observed their walks with carefully averted eyes that nonetheless saw everything. Lady Ravenna cautioned Alara about the growing risk, but the queen-turned-servant could not bring herself to end the deception. Not yet. Not when she was finally discovering the truth of her marriage, even if that truth was breaking her heart. For in those golden hours together, one truth became increasingly clear. Ethelric was capable of profound love and connection, but the object of that newfound affection was not his queen. It was the humble servant she pretended to be. Lady Ravenna's slender fingers trembled as she held the queen's necklace to the light. The sapphire pendant, a wedding gift from King Ethelric to Queen Alara, caught the morning sun streaming through the high windows, casting blue-tinged shadows across her troubled face. She had found it hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Lyra's humble servant quarters during a furtive search. Now, the evidence of deception weighed heavy in her palm, glinting with accusation. For weeks, Lady Ravenna had kept the queen's dangerous secret, had helped orchestrate her transformation from monarch to maid. But watching the king's growing attachment to Lyra filled her with dread. What had begun as a test of fidelity had evolved into something far more perilous. For the queen, for the kingdom, and perhaps most of all, for the fragile heart of the man who wore the crown. Her duty was clear, if painful. With measured steps, she made her way through the castle corridors, past oblivious guards and gossiping courtiers, until she reached the king's private council chamber. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she knocked firmly upon the oak door. "Enter," came the king's voice, distracted and curt. Inside, King Ethelric stood leaning over maps and documents, his advisors having just departed. He glanced up with impatience that quickly transformed to surprise at the sight of the queen's lady-in-waiting. "Lady Ravenna," he acknowledged with a nod. "Have you news of the queen?" The question held a note of hope that made her hesitate, but she had come too far to turn back now. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice tight with tension, "I have discovered something troubling. Something that concerns the new serving maid, Lyra." The king's posture stiffened visibly at the mention of the name. "What of her?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Lady Ravenna extended her hand, the sapphire necklace dangling from her fingers like a condemned man from the gallows. This was found among her possessions, hidden beneath the floorboards of her chamber. The king's face drained of color as recognition dawned. His hand reached for the jewel almost involuntarily, fingers closing around the sapphire with painful familiarity. "This belongs to the queen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was my gift to her on our wedding day." "Yes, Your Majesty." Lady Ravenna paused, then delivered the blow she had rehearsed. "I fear the maid Lyra may not be who she claims. She could be a spy planted by your enemies, or worse, someone who has harmed the queen to steal her possessions." Fury blazed in the king's eyes, a storm-gathering force. "Bring her to me, now." "Your Majesty," Lady Ravenna cautioned, playing her role to perfection. "Perhaps the royal guard should—" "I said bring her," he commanded, his voice cutting through her suggestion like a blade. "Bring her directly to me, and speak of this to no one else. Do you understand?" Lady Ravenna curtsied deeply. "As you wish, Your Majesty." The king paced his chamber like a caged beast, the necklace clutched so tightly in his fist that the edges of the setting bit into his palm. The pain was a welcome distraction from the maelstrom of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. Could it be true? Could the servant who had awakened feelings he thought long dead be a deceiver, a thief, or something far worse, an assassin who had harmed Alara? The very possibility sent ice through his veins, followed swiftly by a shame so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. While his queen was missing, perhaps in danger, perhaps dead, he had been taking garden walks with a serving maid, confiding in her, looking forward to her company with an eagerness he had not felt in years. The bitter irony tasted like ashes in his mouth. When the door opened again, Lyra entered, escorted by Lady Ravenna. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed genuine. For a moment, doubt crept into the king's heart. She looked so innocent, so vulnerable. "Leave us," he ordered Lady Ravenna, who hesitated fractionally before obeying. Silence stretched between king and servant, taut as a bowstring. Alara stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she feared it might shatter them. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it even as she recognized its inevitability. The game had always been destined to end, but not like this. not with the naked pain she saw in Ethelric's eyes. "This," he said at last, holding up the necklace so the sapphire caught the light, "was found in your possession. It belongs to Queen Alara, my wife." Alara swallowed hard, her mind racing for an explanation that might preserve her disguise a while longer. "Your Majesty, The truth," he interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "I want nothing less than the absolute truth, Lyra, if that is even your name." She drew a shaky breath. "I found it, Your Majesty, in the courtyard near the east gate. I know I should have brought it to the steward immediately, but it was so beautiful, and I have never owned anything so fine." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but the alternative was unthinkable. If he discovered her deception now, like this, with anger already burning in his eyes, what then? Would he see her as mad, manipulative? Would the fragile connection they had rebuilt be shattered beyond repair? The king studied her face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. "You expect me to believe that my wife's most treasured possession, which she would never willingly part with, simply fell into your hands?" "I cannot explain how it came to be there, sire," she persisted, eyes downcast in the perfect picture of contrition. "Only that I found it and kept it, which I know was wrong." For a long moment he said nothing, merely circled her slowly, like a predator assessing its prey. Alara held her breath, feeling the weight of his scrutiny like a physical touch. "Do you know what happens to thieves in this kingdom?" he asked finally, his voice deceptively calm. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered. "And to those who may have harmed the queen?" A cold shiver ran down her spine. "I would never harm the queen, sire. I swear it on my life." He stopped directly before her, so close she could feel the heat of his breath, could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, eyes that had once looked at her with such love, then with such indifference, and now with such suspicion. "Why should I believe you?" he demanded. "Because..." She hesitated, then spoke from her heart, forgetting for a moment her disguise. "Because you know me. In these weeks, you have come to know me better perhaps than anyone ever has. Whatever else you may think of me, you must know I am not capable of such evil." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of doubt, a shadow of the trust they had built during their quiet conversations in the garden and by the fire. He stepped back slightly, studying her with renewed intensity. "There is something about you," he said slowly. "Something I cannot place, a familiarity that haunts me." Ilara's heart leapt into her throat. This was the moment she both longed for and dreaded, the moment of recognition, of truth, of judgment. But before she could respond, the chamber door burst open without ceremony. A guard entered, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but there is news. Important news of the Queen." Ethelric whirled toward the guard, the necklace still clutched in his hand. "Speak quickly." "A merchant from the eastern provinces claims to have seen Her Majesty 2 days ago in a village near the border. He swears it was Queen Alara, though she was dressed as a common woman and traveling alone." The news struck the chamber like a thunderbolt. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Someone had fabricated a sighting of her, or worse, had mistaken another woman for their missing queen. Either way, it complicated her already precarious situation immeasurably. The king turned back to her, his expression now impossible to read. "You will remain here in the castle under guard until I return. If your story proves true, you will face the punishment for theft, but nothing worse. If not..." He left the threat unspoken. With swift, decisive movements, he strode to a cabinet and withdrew a map, barking orders to the guard about preparations and escorts. Within moments, the room was a flurry of activity as messengers were dispatched and arrangements made for an immediate departure. Alara stood forgotten in the midst of the chaos, a ghost in her own castle, watching her husband prepare to search for a woman who stood before him unrecognized. The irony might have been amusing if it were not so heartbreaking. As the king prepared to leave the chamber, he paused beside her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "When I return, Lyra, we will finish this conversation. There are questions you must answer." There was something in his tone, not merely suspicion or anger, but a deeper uncertainty, as if he sensed the truth hovering just beyond his grasp. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Alara saw in his gaze a complex tangle of emotions. Doubt, confusion, hurt, and beneath it all, a reluctant tenderness that had not been entirely extinguished by his discovery. Then he was gone in a swirl of royal blue cloak, the door closing firmly behind him. Alara stood alone in his chamber, her disguise intact but her secret teetering on the edge of exposure. She touched her throat where the sapphire had once rested, feeling naked without it. "When you return," she whispered to the empty room, "it may be too late for both of us." The days that followed the king's departure stretched like an endless winter night. The castle hummed with whispers of the missing queen and the mysterious serving maid now under guard. Rumors multiplied like weeds after spring rain. Some claimed Lyra was a witch who had enchanted the king. Others insisted she was a foreign spy, while the more charitable suggested she was merely a thief who had stumbled upon royal treasure. Alara was not imprisoned in the dungeon, at least. The king had ordered her confined to a small chamber near the servants' quarters, with a guard posted outside her door day and night. The room was sparse but clean: a narrow bed, a wooden stool, a basin of water changed daily. Through her single window, she could glimpse a slice of sky and the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the royal forest. The solitude gave her ample time to contemplate the tangled web she had woven, thread by careful thread, until she could no longer see a way to unravel it without destroying everything in the process. What had begun as a simple test of love had transformed into something far more complex and dangerous. She had sought to discover if Ethelric could still love the woman beneath the crown, only to learn a more painful truth. He could love, deeply and genuinely, but not the queen he had married, only the servant she pretended to be. Lady Ravenna was her sole visitor, bringing food and news, her expression growing more concerned with each passing day. "The entire kingdom searches for you," she whispered during one such visit, setting down a tray of bread and stew. "While you sit here, disguised as a thief, this madness must end, Your Majesty." Alara stared into the wooden bowl, watching steam rise in delicate spirals. "How can I end it now? If I reveal myself, what then? I would be not just a queen who abandoned her duties, but a woman who deceived her husband, her court, her people." "Better that than a queen presumed dead or abducted," Ravenna countered. "Already there are whispers of war, of neighboring kingdoms suspected of kidnapping you to destabilize the realm." The weight of consequences Alara had not foreseen pressed down upon her shoulders. In her focus on the intimate drama of her marriage, she had forgotten the broader stage upon which royal lives were played. Her personal quest for truth could have political repercussions far beyond the castle walls. "And what of the king?" she asked quietly. "What news of his search?" Lady Ravenna's face softened with reluctant sympathy. "He rides as if demons pursue him, barely stopping to eat or rest. The reports say he personally questions every witness, examines every scrap of evidence. He has offered rewards so generous that peasants are claiming to have seen the queen in every village from here to the eastern border." "He searches so desperately for a woman who sits under his own roof," Alara murmured, the irony tasting bitter on her tongue. "Is it the queen he searches for so frantically, or is it absolution?" Ravenna asked pointedly. "Perhaps in finding you, he hopes to cleanse himself of the guilt he feels for his growing affection for a serving maid." The words struck Alara like a physical blow. Was that all her deception had accomplished, adding guilt to the emotional distance that already divided them? Had she merely given Ethelric another reason to view their marriage as a burden rather than a blessing? The castle bell tolled the hour, its deep resonance penetrating even the thick stone walls of her confinement. With each peal, Alara felt the pressure of time, of decisions that could no longer be postponed, of truths that would soon demand to be spoken aloud. On the 5th day of her confinement, as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Alara heard the distant clamor that signaled the king's return. Horns blew, hooves clattered on cobblestones, voices called out greetings and questions. She pressed herself against the window, straining to see, but her view revealed nothing of the courtyard below. Hours passed. She paced the small chamber, rehearsing words that might explain, might justify, might salvage something from the wreckage of her scheme. But each imagined conversation ended the same way, with betrayal in Ethelric's eyes, with the final severing of whatever fragile bond still connected them. When her chamber door finally opened, well past midnight, it was not the king who entered, but a castle steward, his face grave in the flickering light of his lantern. "His Majesty commands your presence," he announced without preamble. The walk through the darkened castle corridors felt like a funeral procession. Guards flanked her, their expressions impassive, their hands resting meaningfully on sword hilts. Servants they passed stopped and stared, then huddled in whispered conversation as she moved beyond earshot. The steward led her not to the king's council chamber or his private apartments, but to the throne room, a formal space used for public audiences and official proclamations. The choice of location sent a chill through Alara's heart. This would be no intimate confrontation, but a formal judgment. The vast room was dimly lit, most of the torches extinguished for the night. At the far end, the twin thrones stood upon their dais, one occupied, one conspicuously empty. King Ethelric sat rigid, still dressed in his travel-stained riding clothes, his face haggard with exhaustion and something deeper, more painful. As she approached, walking the length of the room with measured steps, Alara saw the physical toll of his fruitless search. New lines carved his face and silver threaded the temples of his dark hair. Changes subtle enough that only a wife would notice, yet profound enough to constrict her heart with guilt. When she reached the foot of the dais, she sank into the deep curtsy of a servant, her eyes fixed on the stone floor. For several long moments, silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. "Look at me," he finally commanded, his voice rough with fatigue. She raised her eyes, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since his return. What she saw there nearly broke her resolve. Not anger, not suspicion, but a bone-deep weariness and confusion that aged him beyond his years. "Do you know what I found on my journey?" he asked without preamble. She shook her head silently. "Nothing," he said simply. "Rumors, whispers, false hopes. I rode to 3 different villages where the queen was supposedly seen. In one, the woman turned out to be a merchant's wife who resembles Alara only in the color of her hair. In another, the sighting was invented by a tavern keeper hoping for the reward. In the third," he trailed off, passing a hand over his face in a gesture of profound exhaustion. "In the third," he continued quietly, "I found myself searching the face of every woman I passed, hoping against reason that one of them would be her. I realized then that I no longer even remembered precisely what my wife looked like. I could recall the crown upon her head, the robes of her station, but her face, her true face, had become a blur in my memory." The confession pierced Alara to her core. This was the truth she had sought, laid bare in all its painful clarity. Her husband had forgotten how to see her, had reduced her to the symbols of her station rather than the woman who wore them. "And then," the king went on, his voice dropping even lower, "in the quiet of night, when exhaustion finally claimed me, it was not my queen's face I saw in my dreams, but yours." He leaned forward on his throne, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Who are you, Lyra? What spell have you cast that makes me think of you when my kingdom totters on the edge of crisis? When my queen is missing? When everything I have built threatens to crumble beneath my feet?" Alara trembled at the precipice of truth. One word from her would end the deception, would transform this moment from an interrogation into something else entirely. But what would follow? Reconciliation, or a deeper final estrangement? "I am no one, Your Majesty," she whispered. "Just a servant who found a jewel and kept it when she should not have." "No," he said with sudden certainty. "You are more than that. There is something in you. Something that has haunted me since the moment I first saw you scrubbing the great hall floor at dawn." He descended the dais steps slowly, approaching her until barely an arm's length separated them. This close, she could smell the dust of the road on his clothes, could see the dried salt tracks of tears on his cheeks. Tears for a missing queen, shed by a man who could not see that she stood before him. "There is confusion in the castle," he said abruptly. "During my absence, a strange letter appeared, placed directly upon the throne you see behind me. It said, The queen is among you. Ilara's breath caught. Lady Ravenna. It could only have been her, attempting to end the charade before it spiraled further out of control. The court buzzes with theories, the king continued. Some believe it a taunt from whoever has taken the queen. Others think it a warning that an impostor walks among us. But I wonder, his voice dropped to a near whisper, I wonder if it means something else entirely. He circled her slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. Remove your head covering, he commanded suddenly. Ilara's hand rose involuntarily to the cloth that concealed her golden hair, her most recognizable feature, the one that had inspired bards to compose sonnets when she first arrived at court as a young bride. Your Majesty, Remove it, he repeated, his tone brooking no refusal. With trembling fingers, she untied the knot beneath her chin. The simple cloth fell away, releasing waves of gold that tumbled past her shoulders, catching the torchlight like spun metal. A sharp intake of breath told her that despite the grime of weeks of servants' work, this feature at least remained unmistakable. The king took a step back, his expression transforming from suspicion to disbelief. It cannot be, he whispered. But the truth had begun its inexorable emergence, like a sword slowly drawn from its scabbard. Painful, dangerous, impossible to halt once begun. I must know, he said hoarsely. I must know who you are, and I will discover the truth, whatever it may be. Darkness shrouded the small chamber, broken only by the pale moonlight streaming through the narrow window. Ilara sat motionless on the edge of her bed, listening to the night sounds of the castle, distant footsteps of guards patrolling the corridors, the occasional call of an owl from the forest beyond the walls, the soft sigh of wind through ancient stonework. Sleep had abandoned her entirely, leaving her alone with thoughts that circled like hungry wolves. After the confrontation in the throne room, the king had ordered her confined to her quarters once more, his expression unreadable as guards led her away. Though he had seen her golden hair, that unmistakable mark of her identity, he had not openly acknowledged the truth that surely must be dawning in his mind. Instead, he had retreated into silence, his eyes haunted with questions he seemed afraid to voice aloud. The sapphire necklace lay hidden beneath her thin mattress, retrieved from the king's chambers by Lady Ravenna through means Ilara dared not question. Its weight was both comfort and accusation, a symbol of all she had risked and potentially lost in her desperate gamble to reclaim her husband's heart. As the midnight bell tolled across the castle grounds, Ilara heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps, heavier than a servant's, more purposeful than a guard's routine patrol. Her heart quickened as they stopped outside her door. A key turned in the lock with deliberate slowness, as if the person on the other side was hesitating, still deciding whether to proceed. The door swung open to reveal King Ethelric's silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. He carried no torch or lantern, as if preferring the concealment of shadows for what was to come. He entered alone, closing the door behind him, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silent room. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a darker shape against the darkness, his breathing the only indication of his presence. Ilara remained seated on the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to still their trembling. I could not sleep, he finally said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him. Nor I, Your Majesty, she replied, equally soft. He moved then, crossing to the small table where a pitcher of water and a cup had been left. Instead of pouring a drink, however, he reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something that caught the moonlight with a blue gleam, the sapphire necklace. This belonged to my wife, he said, turning the jewel so that it scattered fragments of azure light across the stone walls. I gave it to her on our wedding day. She never removed it until she vanished. Ilara swallowed hard, saying nothing. Strange, he continued, as if speaking to himself rather than to her, how an object can hold so much memory. When I look at this, I see not just a jewel, but the moment I placed it around her neck, the way her eyes lit up, the promise we made to each other, a promise that somewhere, somehow, we seem to have forgotten. He approached the bed slowly, the necklace dangling from his fingers. Lyra, he said, the false name heavy with significance. This necklace was in your possession. I want to know how it came to be there. No more lies, no more evasions. The truth, whatever it may be. Ilara's heart pounded so fiercely she was certain he must hear it in the quiet room. The moment of reckoning had arrived, unavoidable as dawn after the longest night. "The necklace is mine," she whispered. "It has always been mine." The king went utterly still. "What are you saying?" She rose from the bed then, standing to face him fully in the moonlight that spilled across the chamber floor. With deliberate movements, she reached up and brushed back her hair, tilting her face so that the silver light illuminated features that scrubbing and exhaustion had altered but not erased. "Look at me, Ethelric," she said, abandoning all pretense of servile address. "Look at me and tell me what you see." He took a half-step backward, his eyes widening as they traveled over her face, searching, questioning, disbelieving. "It cannot be," he breathed. "Can it not?" she challenged softly. "Have I changed so much? Or did you simply never truly see me to begin with?" His hand, still clutching the necklace, began to tremble visibly. "Ilara?" The name emerged as a question, hesitant and fearful. She neither confirmed nor denied, letting the truth emerge in his consciousness like a shape gradually discerned in fog. "Why?" he demanded suddenly, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why would you do this? Do you know what these weeks have been like? The fear, the search parties, the diplomatic crises with neighboring kingdoms suspected of abducting you. I needed to know." She answered simply. "Know what?" His voice rose, echoing against stone walls. "What truth could possibly be worth this deception? Whether you could still love the woman beneath the crown." Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "Whether what stood between us was truly duty and circumstance, or something deeper and more irrevocable." The king staggered slightly, as if her words had physical weight. He groped behind him for the room's sole chair, sinking onto it with the stunned expression of a man who has taken a mortal blow, but has yet to feel its full pain. "All this time," he said hoarsely, "all these weeks of searching, of fear, you were here, serving in my chambers, walking with me in the gardens, listening to my most private thoughts." His voice hardened with each word. "Laughing at my blindness." "No!" Ilara moved toward him instinctively, then stopped when he flinched away. "Never that. I was not laughing, Ethelric. I was learning. About you, about us, about what we had lost without even realizing it was gone." "And what was that?" he asked bitterly. "What great wisdom did your masquerade reveal?" Ilara took a deep breath, gathering courage for the hardest truth of all. "That you are still capable of profound love and connection, but not with your queen. With a serving maid who looked you in the eye instead of bowing her head, who questioned instead of obeyed, who saw the man beneath the king and spoke to him as an equal, not a subject." The words hung between them, sharp as newly forged blades. In the king's face, shock gave way to a complex mixture of emotions: hurt, betrayal, confusion, and beneath it all, the dawning recognition that she spoke the truth. "You deceived me," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "You made me question my own sanity. You made me grieve for a woman who was never missing. And you forgot how to see me," she countered quietly. "Long before I disappeared, you looked at me and saw only the queen, the symbol, the crown, not the woman, not Ilara." He rose suddenly, pacing the small confines of the chamber like a caged animal. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The damage to the kingdom, to our allies, to our people's trust?" "I know," she acknowledged, the weight of consequence heavy in her voice. "And I will bear whatever judgment comes. But first, answer me one question, honestly. When did you last look at Queen Ilara the way you looked at Lyra in the garden? When did you last confide in your wife the way you confided in a serving maid by the fireside?" The question struck home. She could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the momentary closing of his eyes against a painful realization. "That's not fair," he said, but the anger had drained from his voice, leaving only exhaustion. "None of this is fair," she agreed. "Neither what I did, nor what happened to us before I did it. Silence fell between them again, dense with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. The necklace in the king's hand caught a ray of moonlight, sending a blue reflection dancing across his troubled face. "Why did you not simply speak to me?" he asked at last. "Why this elaborate deception instead of honest words?" Alara's laugh held no mirth. "Would you have heard them? Or would you have nodded absently, your mind already on the next council meeting, the next diplomatic crisis, the next duty that required the king's attention, while the man's heart withered unnoticed?" He flinched as if struck. "Was I truly so blind?" "We both were," she said softly. "I saw the king, not the man beneath who carried burdens I never tried to understand. You saw the queen, not the woman who longed for more than ceremonial closeness. We became our titles to each other and forgot to be husband and wife." Ethelric moved to the window, staring out at the night sky as if searching for answers among the stars. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with unshed tears. "What happens now, Alara? How do we explain this to the court, to our allies, to our people? How do I explain that my queen disguised herself as a servant to test my love, and I failed to recognize her? Perhaps," she suggested gently, "we don't explain at all." He turned to face her, confusion evident in his expression. "Leave tonight," she continued, "before dawn. Tell no one, not even a guard. You're asking me to run away, to abandon my duties, my kingdom?" "I'm asking you to find yourself again," she corrected. "The man who exists beneath the crown, the one who once loved a woman, not a queen." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "And what of you? What of Alara? She will be gone by morning as well," she said simply. "Let the mystery of the missing queen continue a while longer." Understanding dawned slowly in his eyes. "You cannot mean this." "I do," she insisted. "Sometimes a thing must be broken completely before it can be remade into something stronger, something truer." The king, no, the man, looked down at the sapphire necklace still clutched in his hand, then back at the woman who stood before him. Neither queen nor servant now, but something in between, something real. "I need time," he said finally. "Time to think, to understand all that has happened, all that it means." Alara nodded, accepting this neither as rejection nor forgiveness, but as the honest response it was. "Then take it. But when dawn comes, I will be gone. If you wish to find me, truly find me, you will know where to look." He moved toward the door then, pausing with his hand on the latch. Without turning, he said quietly, "I did love you, Alara. Perhaps not as well as I should have, but I did love you." "I know," she replied softly, "and I loved you. Perhaps that's why this hurts so much, because what we lost was real." The king nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, then opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The lock did not click behind him, a silent acknowledgement of her freedom to choose her own path. As his footsteps faded into the distance, Alara moved to the window, gazing out at the kingdom that had been her home, her prison, her purpose. By this time tomorrow, she would be far from these stone walls, these gilded cages. Whether alone or not remained to be seen. The morning light spilled across the empty throne, turning the polished wood to gold. King Ethelric stood motionless before it, his eyes fixed on the single sheet of parchment that lay upon the royal seat. The letter had been discovered by a chamber servant at dawn, carefully placed where only the king would find it, sealed with a drop of blue wax pressed with the queen's personal signet ring, a ring that, like its wearer, had vanished from the castle. For nearly an hour he had stood there, the unopened letter in his trembling hands, afraid of what truths it might contain. The events of the previous night still seemed like a fever dream. The confrontation in the servants' quarters, the revelation of Alara's deception, the painful truths they had hurled at each other like weapons. With a deep breath that did nothing to calm his racing heart, he finally broke the seal. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant yet strong, each letter formed with the precise confidence that characterized everything about the woman he had married. The woman he had lost, not once but twice, first through neglect, then through deception. My dearest Ethelric, by the time you read these words, I will be gone from the castle, perhaps gone from your life entirely. That outcome now rests in your hands, as it always did, though neither of us fully understood the power we held over each other's happiness. I cannot ask your forgiveness for my deception, for I am not certain I regret it, even knowing the pain it has caused. In those weeks as Lyra, I discovered truths about you, about myself, about us, that might otherwise have remained buried beneath the weight of crowns and duties and courtly pretense. Painful truths, yes, but necessary ones if we are ever to find our way back to each other, not as king and queen, but as man and woman. What began as a test of your fidelity became something far more profound, a journey to rediscover what we had lost. I sought to learn if you could still see me without the trappings of royalty, if you could still love the woman beneath the crown. What I discovered was both more hopeful and more devastating than I had imagined. You are still capable of seeing truly, of loving deeply, of connecting soul to soul. I witnessed this in every conversation by the fireside, every walk in the garden, every moment when you spoke to Lyra not as a servant, but as a human being worthy of respect and interest. You opened your heart to her in ways you had forgotten to do with me. The fault does not lie with you alone. I, too, forgot how to be seen. I hid behind the perfect mask of queenship, afraid that if I showed you my doubts, my fears, my ordinary human heart, you would think me unworthy of the crown I wore. We both retreated into our roles until we could no longer find each other across the chasm of duty and ceremony that divided us. Do you remember the night we met before I was promised to you, when you came to my father's castle disguised as a common knight? You said you wanted to know if I would love the man before I ever saw the king. I did. That night, dancing beneath the harvest moon, I loved you for your laugh, your kindness, your passionate ideas about how the world could be better. I loved the man, not the crown he was destined to wear. Somewhere in the years that followed, we both forgot that night and its lesson. We allowed ourselves to become symbols rather than souls, duties rather than desires. The very power that should have freed us to love more deeply instead imprisoned us in expectations neither could fulfill. I do not know what comes next, my love. I go now to find myself again. Not Queen Alara, but the woman who exists beneath the titles and responsibilities. I go to remember who I was before the weight of a kingdom's future rested on my shoulders. I go to discover if that woman is one you could love again, not out of duty or habit, but with the same fire that once burned between us. If you wish to find me, look not in royal courts or noble houses. Look instead where burdens are lifted rather than bestowed, where hands serve rather than command, where hearts connect without the barriers of rank and precedent. Look for the woman who dared to clean her own castle floors to rediscover what truly matters. The choice now is yours. You may declare me dead or fled or mad, whatever best serves the kingdom you have sworn to protect. You may find another queen whose sense of duty will never lead her to such desperate measures as mine. You may continue as you always have, a good king who gradually forgets the man he might have been. Or you may choose another path entirely, one that requires as much courage as any battle you have faced, as much wisdom as any treaty you have negotiated, as much faith as any prayer you have offered. You may choose to set aside the crown, if only for a time, to seek what has been lost. Know this: whether you come for me or not, whether we find our way back to each other or part forever, I have loved you. Not perfectly, not wisely perhaps, but truly. I have loved the boy who became a prince, the prince who became a king, and most of all, the man who exists beneath it all. The man I glimpsed again in those precious moments when you spoke to a serving maid, as if her thoughts and feelings mattered as much as any nobles in your court. That is the man worth loving. That is the man worth finding again, whether I am by your side or not. With hope, with sorrow, with love that remains despite everything, Alara. The parchment trembled in the king's hands as he read the final words. A single tear escaped his tightly controlled composure, falling onto the letter and blurring the ink of her name. Then another, and another. Until at last, alone in the throne room where none could witness, King Ethelric wept openly. Not for the kingdom's missing queen, but for the wife he had failed to see, the love he had allowed to wither through neglect, the man he had forgotten how to be. When the storm of emotion finally passed, he carefully folded the letter and placed it inside his tunic, close to his heart. With measured steps, he crossed to the window that overlooked the castle gardens, his gaze drawn to the bench where he had sat with Lyra, sharing thoughts he had never trusted to his queen. The irony cut deep, a wound that might never fully heal. Yet beneath the pain lay something unexpected, a fragile seed of hope that perhaps what had been broken could be remade. What had been lost might yet be found. For days afterward, the king moved through the castle like a ghost, speaking only when necessary, eating little, sleeping less. The court whispered of his strange melancholy, attributing it to the continued absence of the queen and the pressures of ruling alone. None suspected the truth, that their sovereign was engaged in the most difficult battle of his life, a war not against external enemies, but against the walls he had built around his own heart. He spent hours in the royal gardens, sitting on the stone bench where he had come to know Lyra. Sometimes he would bring a book, pretending to read while his mind traveled far beyond the castle walls, searching for a woman who had shown him truths he had been unwilling to face. In the evenings he would walk alone through the great hall, his footsteps echoing in the empty space where he had first encountered a servant with familiar eyes. He would stop at the exact spot where she had knelt, scrubbing the floor, trying to understand how he could have failed to recognize the woman he had sworn to love until death. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, he found himself drawn to a forgotten corner of the garden where white roses climbed an ancient stone wall. There, half hidden among the blooms, he discovered a small cloth, a servant's head covering, abandoned in haste. He lifted it gently, breathing in the faint scent that clung to the fabric, a scent not of perfume or rose water, but of honest labor and quiet dignity. Clutched in his hand, the simple cloth became more precious than any royal treasure, for it had touched the face of the woman who had dared everything to save what they had lost. The woman who had stripped away all pretense to reveal the painful truth of what they had become to each other. As night fell fully, wrapping the garden in velvet darkness, King Ethelric made the decision that would change not only his life, but the course of his kingdom. With the quiet certainty of a man who has fought his way through confusion to clarity, he summoned his most trusted advisor. "I will be leaving the castle," he announced without preamble. "I do not know when I will return." The elderly counselor's face registered shock, then alarm. "Your Majesty, the kingdom cannot be without its ruler. With the queen already missing, the kingdom will be in your capable hands," the king interrupted. "You have guided me since I was a boy. You can certainly guide the court in my absence." "But sire, where will you go? What shall I tell the people?" Ethelric's gaze drifted to the window, where stars were beginning to appear against the darkening sky. "Tell them their king goes to find what he has lost, something more precious than gold, more powerful than armies, more essential than crowns." Understanding dawned slowly in the old man's eyes. "The queen," he breathed. "You know where she is?" "No," Ethelric replied with unexpected honesty. "But I know where to begin looking, and I know that I must find her not as a king reclaiming his queen, but as a man seeking the woman he loves, the woman he failed to truly see until she vanished before his eyes." The next morning, as dawn broke over the kingdom, rumors spread rapidly through the castle and beyond. King Ethelric had departed in the night, taking neither royal guard nor courtiers, dressed not in the finery of his station, but in the simple garb of a common traveler. He had left behind his crown, placed pointedly upon his empty throne, a message whose meaning spawned 100 different interpretations among those who witnessed it. All that was certain was this: a king had set aside his crown to search for something he valued more. And somewhere, in a place none could guess, a woman who had once been a queen and then a servant waited to discover if the man she loved could find his way back to her, and to himself. Autumn painted the world in shades of amber and gold, the forest canopy ablaze with color against a crisp blue sky. The narrow road wound through valleys and over gentle hills, connecting villages that had changed little over centuries. Here, far from the castle's grandeur and the court's intrigue, life followed the ancient rhythms of sowing and harvesting, of birth and death, of seasons turning in their eternal dance. The man who walked this road bore little resemblance to a king. His clothes, though well made, were those of a prosperous merchant or perhaps a minor nobleman. Practical garments suited for travel, unmarked by royal insignia. His boots showed the dust of many miles, his face the weathering of sun and wind. Only his posture, the straight spine, the squared shoulders, the deliberate stride, hinted at the authority he had set aside but could not entirely shed. 3 months had passed since King Ethelric had placed his crown upon an empty throne and walked away from everything he had been taught to value. 3 months of searching, of questioning, of following whispered rumors through a dozen villages and twice as many false leads. 3 months of learning to be simply a man in a world that had always treated him as more, and sometimes less, than that. The search had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. His hands, once smooth from a life of privilege, now bore calluses from helping mend a broken wagon wheel, from carrying a child across a swollen stream, from 100 small acts of ordinary living. His face had gained new lines around the eyes, not from the strain of ruling, but from squinting into sunlight, from genuine smiles exchanged with strangers who saw him not as sovereign but as fellow traveler. Yet despite all he had gained, he had not found what he sought most desperately. In each village, he listened for stories of a golden-haired woman who had appeared without explanation and offered her service without reservation. In each settlement, his hopes rose and fell like autumn leaves caught in a capricious wind. Until today. Until this village nestled in a valley beside a lazy river, where the first person he encountered, an old woman gathering firewood, had nodded knowingly at his careful questions and pointed toward a modest building near the village edge. "The healing house," she had said. "That's where you'll find her. The lady with hands that heal and eyes that see too much. She came in summer when the fever was taking our children, stayed when others fled, never said where she came from, but some say she once wore finer clothes than she does now." The old woman had studied him with shrewd eyes. As did you, I'd wager. Now, standing before the simple timber-framed structure, Ethelric found himself paralyzed by an emotion he had rarely experienced as king: fear, pure, humbling fear. What if she rejected him? What if the chasm between them had grown too wide to bridge? What if the man he had become in these months of searching was still not the man she had hoped to find? The sound of children's laughter broke his reverie. The door of the healing house opened and 3 young boys raced out, their faces bright with health and mischief. Behind them appeared a woman, golden hair pulled back in a simple braid, her plain dress covered by an apron stained with herbs and tinctures. She called after the children with mock severity, a smile warming her voice despite her words of caution. And then she saw him. Time suspended itself in that moment of recognition. The world narrowed to the space between them, a few yards of dusty earth that somehow contained the weight of all they had been to each other, all they had lost, all they might yet become. Ilara stood perfectly still, her hand frozen in the act of brushing a strand of hair from her face. She looked different from both the queen he had married and the servant she had pretended to be. This woman before him seemed to have gathered strength from both identities while being bound by neither. Her face showed a new serenity, her posture a quiet confidence that owed nothing to crowns or titles. "You found me," she said finally, her voice carrying across the distance between them. "I had to," he replied simply. She studied him with the directness he remembered from their garden conversations, when she had been Lyra and he had been merely himself. "It took you long enough. I got lost along the way," he admitted. "Not in the forests or on the roads, but in myself. I had to find the man before I could find the woman he loves." Something flickered in her eyes at these words. Hope, perhaps, or wariness, or some complex emotion that had no single name. "And did you?" she asked. "Find him, I mean." Ethelric took a step toward her, then another, closing the physical distance with deliberate care, aware that the greater distance, the one between their hearts, would require more than mere proximity to bridge. "I believe I have," he said. "Though he is not the man I thought I was. He is more flawed, more vulnerable, more human." She remained where she stood, neither advancing nor retreating, her eyes never leaving his face. And who is he, this man you found? Someone who finally understands what you tried to teach him, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. That power means nothing if it separates us from what truly matters. That a crown can become a wall between two hearts. That love withers when we forget to serve it daily, with humility and attention. He was close enough now to see the subtle changes in her face, the light dusting of freckles across her nose from days spent under the open sky, the tiny laugh lines at the corners of her eyes, the new strength in her jawline. She was more beautiful to him now than she had ever been upon a throne, adorned with jewels and wrapped in the trappings of royalty. "Now I know what love is," he said, the words emerging as both confession and revelation. Ilara regarded him steadily, her expression guarded yet hopeful. "Do you? Love is seeing truly. Not the crown or the title or the power, but the person who bears them, with all their strengths and frailties." He paused, gathering courage for perhaps the most important words he would ever speak. "Love is finding you here, not as my queen, but as the woman who had the courage to break everything we thought we were in order to discover what we might become." For one eternal moment she remained silent, her face unreadable. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Then the test is over." Relief and joy washed through him like a cleansing tide. He closed the final distance between them, reaching for her hands, hands that showed the honest work of these months, hands that had healed and served and built a new life far from castle comforts. She allowed him to take them, her fingers curling around his with tentative hope. "What happens now?" she asked. "Do we return to the castle, to crowns and thrones and duties?" "I don't know," he answered with an honesty that would have been impossible for the man he had been before. "The kingdom awaits, yes, but perhaps it awaits a different kind of king and queen than the ones who left it." Around them, the village continued its daily rhythm. A cart creaked past, loaded with autumn harvest. A blacksmith's hammer rang in the distance. Children's voices called to one another in some game of their own devising. This ordinary world, so far removed from the rarefied air of court, suddenly seemed to hold all the wisdom they had been seeking. "Whatever we decide," Ilara said, "we decide together. Not as ruler and consort, but as equals who have both learned what it costs to forget the person behind the role." He nodded, overwhelmed by the second chance they were granting each other. Without conscious thought, he released her hands only to embrace her fully, holding her close as if to assure himself that she was real, that this moment was not another dream born of longing and regret. She returned the embrace with equal fervor, her face pressed against his shoulder, her arms strong around him. They stood thus for a long moment, neither speaking, both acutely aware of all that had been risked, all that had been lost, all that might yet be regained. When they finally drew apart, Ilara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "There is something you should see," she said, taking his hand and leading him toward the village square. The small open area at the heart of the village bustled with activity. Farmers sold their produce from rough wooden stalls. Children darted between the legs of browsing adults. An old man played a lively tune on a battered fiddle while a few couples danced on the packed earth. "Watch," Ilara instructed, gesturing toward the scene before them. Ethelric observed, uncertain what she wished him to see. Then understanding dawned. Here were people who had never seen the inside of a castle, who would bow to a king but who lived their lives according to more fundamental laws, the need for food and shelter, for community and purpose, for love and meaning. "They don't need us to be perfect," she said softly. "They need us to be present, to remember that behind every policy, every tax, every law, are people like these, people who laugh and grieve and struggle and celebrate." He squeezed her hand in acknowledgement. "I see it now. I see them." "As do I," she replied. "Perhaps that was the purpose of our separation, to learn to see again, with clear eyes and open hearts." The church bell rang out across the village, its deep tones carried on the autumn breeze. Without discussion, they began walking toward the sound, their hands still joined, their steps falling naturally into the same rhythm. No vows were exchanged. for all necessary promises had already been made and broken and remade in the crucible of their separation and reunion. No rings were given, for the bonds that now connected them were forged of stronger stuff than gold. As they walked through the village that had become her home and might yet become his sanctuary, Ethelric stooped suddenly and picked up something from the dusty path, his crown, which he had carried with him throughout his journey, a reminder of what he had been and might be again. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it gently on the ground between them. "The man, not the king," he said simply, taking her hands in his once more. Alara's smile broke like dawn across her face. Not the practiced, perfect smile of a queen, but the genuine joy of a woman who had wagered everything on love's possibility and won. "The woman, not the queen," she answered. And in that moment, as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the village square and distant church bells called the faithful to prayer, two people who had lost their way found it again, not on a throne or in a castle, but in the simple truth of hearts that had finally learned to see beyond the glittering distractions of power to the quiet miracle of genuine connection. The test of the heart was complete, and they had both at last passed. How many of us wear invisible crowns in our own relationships? The weight of expectations, responsibilities, and roles we play can slowly build walls between even the most devoted hearts. Queen Alara's desperate gamble to disguise herself as a servant in her own castle reminds us of a painful truth. Sometimes we must lose everything to find what truly matters. What would you risk to rediscover the person you fell in love with? Would you have the courage to strip away all pretense, all status, all comfort, just to be seen for who you truly are? King Ethelric and Queen Alara's journey teaches us that love isn't found in grand palaces or royal titles, but in the quiet moments of genuine connection, in the vulnerability of being truly known by another soul. Perhaps the greatest kingdoms we rule are not those marked on maps, but the intimate realms of our own hearts. Remember that the most precious treasure isn't gold or jewels, but the miracle of being truly seen by someone who chooses to love us despite knowing our deepest truths. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded of what matters most. Subscribe to see more tales that illuminate the hidden chambers of the human heart, and leave a comment telling us, what disguises have you worn that prevented you from being truly seen?